Howdy. This lecture is for the course INST 222, Foundations of Education in a Multicultural Society. This is part 2 of Multicultural Education Reading number 1. Begins on page 5 through page 20. Our objective is to be able to understand the dimensions of multicultural education, and we'll do that through lecture and discussion. Here are some key terms for this lecture. Please make a note of them. Part 1 of the reading talks about the aims and goals of multicultural education. If you go to page 5 of your reading, you can read them for yourself, but goal number 1, according to Banks and Banks of multicultural education, is to reform schools, colleges, and universities so that students from diverse racial, ethnic, and social class groups will experience educational equality. The reading goes on to say that another important goal of multicultural education is to give both male and female students an equal chance to experience educational success and mobility. I think it's fair to say that it just doesn't stop at those groups, ethnic groups and gender groups, but multicultural education really appeals to all cultural groups so that all cultural groups will experience educational equality. The reading goes on to tell us at the bottom of page 5 that there is this limited conception that exists when it comes to multicultural education. The last sentence on page 5 says, however, many school and university practitioners have a limited conception of multicultural education. They view it primarily as curriculum reform that involves changing or restructuring the curriculum to include content about ethnic groups, women, and other cultural groups. This conception of multicultural education is widespread and wrong, I might add, because curriculum reform was the main focus when the movement first emerged in the 60s and 70s. So people have a limited conception of what multicultural education is all about. They think it's all about just adding content about these other groups. But we're going to learn that it's more than just content. The author goes on to tell us that there are these dimensions of multicultural education, these 5 dimensions that we need to be aware of to better understand the field. And they tell us that there is this controversy that exists in the field that we need to be aware of. If you go to page 6, you can find that. And the authors say that part of the controversy in multicultural education results from the fact that many writers in the popular press see it only as content integration and as an educational movement that benefits only people of color. When multicultural education is conceptualized broadly, it becomes clear that it is for all students and not just for low-income students and for students of color. So that's part of the controversy because we are explaining it and talking about it as if it's just something for people who are other. And that's one of the myths and misconceptions about multicultural education. The reality is we all need to learn about the diversity that has always existed and contributed to this great nation of ours. The author goes on to tell us about the importance of knowledge construction. And the authors tell us that the kind of knowledge that teachers examine and master will have a powerful influence on the teaching methods they create and their interpretations of school knowledge and on how they use student cultural knowledge. The knowledge construction process is fundamental in the implementation of multicultural education. It has implications for each of the other 4 dimensions. So as we're going to learn, and as the reading shares, so there is these 5 dimensions or parts of multicultural education that help us to understand how this field works. And that understanding knowledge construction, that dimension, will help us understand the other 4 dimensions as well. The author tells us that there is this relationship of these 5 dimensions that we're going to talk about, and that we should understand that each of these dimensions of multicultural education, they're each distinct, but at the same time they're interrelated. That means that they overlap. So for example, you can't talk about knowledge construction without talking about how it affects and is affected by equity pedagogy. So as we learn about these 5 dimensions, it's important that they each have their own idea and own descriptions, but we should also understand that they have a unique relationship as well. These dimensions do overlap. So we're moving on to part 4 of the reading, and the authors talk about the meaning of multicultural education to teachers. A lot of teachers, especially in the areas of math and science, don't think that it applies to them, that you can't pull multicultural education into the math classroom or into the science classroom, and this is absolutely false. I think it's because they get stuck in conceptualizing what this field is all about. They usually think it's just about content integration, where we talk about, other groups of people, other cultural groups, and we somehow find a way to put it into the curriculum. Well, that's just part of it. And if that's all you think it is, you're not going to really appreciate the field. The other part of multicultural education is about the changes to teaching. And so it's not just what you teach, but it's about how you share the material, how you connect with the learners as well. So when you put these changes in your teaching styles and strategies and your approach, and you connect it with new content about other groups that may have been left out from the curriculum, this brings us to a new awareness of multicultural education, a new phase conceptualization about what the field is all about. As we talk about multicultural education a little bit more, we understand that a lot of teachers are frustrated with multicultural education, and the authors say on page 9 that we need to do a better job of contextualizing the concept of multicultural education. When we tell practitioners that multicultural education implies reform in a discipline or subject without specifying in detail the nature of that reform, we risk frustrating motivated and committed teachers because they do not have the knowledge and skills to act on their beliefs. Educators who reject multicultural education will use the irrelevance of multicultural education argument as a convenient and publicly sanctioned form of resistance and as a justification to inaction. So what the author is trying to tell us is that we don't do a good enough job sort of explaining, how to take these ideas and showing teachers how to put it into their discipline. We're not there yet. In a one-course approach, we can't do that. Perhaps in an advanced course, we could do that. And I think that is exactly what a lot of teacher preparation programs absolutely need. The authors go on to tell us that a lot of math and science teachers don't have cultural knowledge. They have subject matter knowledge, but they don't have cultural knowledge. So they know about biology and they know about chemistry, but they don't have the historical and cultural knowledge to help bring their subject to life from various different perspectives. What they need to do in their disciplines is to invite a multicultural perspective, and that is just going beyond what the textbook creators give us, but that is sharing information from several points of view. Taking a look at the issue, for example, the cotton gin, and taking a look at it from the perspective of what was going on with the female inventor that happened to be in the room but didn't get any credit for it. So we need to take into account the various perspectives that exist, and not just that one Eurocentric perspective that is often shared in math and science curricula. In letter D at the bottom of our screen, the authors say that teachers need a new way of viewing reality or multiple perspectives. And so in this way, they go beyond just this one perspective approach, and that they learn how to look at an issue from various layers and from various points of view. As we get into the 5 dimensions of multicultural education, we begin with content integration, and this is one of the parts of multicultural education that help us to understand how this approach works. And our authors tell us on page 10 that content integration deals with the extent to which teachers use, here's the key word, examples and content from a variety of cultures to illustrate key concepts, principles, and generalizations. So in this way, the focus here in multicultural education are those sources of data and information that you're bringing into the classroom, whether it's guest speakers or a textbook, a movie, whatever the case may be, you are looking at the content itself and looking to see that you are ensuring that multiple perspectives of that discipline are shared. As we move on to knowledge construction, the authors tell us that knowledge construction is used by teachers to help students understand, investigate, and determine how implicit cultural assumptions, frames of reference, perspectives, and biases within the discipline influence the ways in which knowledge is constructed. So in the knowledge construction process, we are looking at knowledge and understanding that all knowledge is biased. If it comes from someplace, it comes from a person, that person is biased. It has their proclivities, their ideas about information. All of that helps to shadow and create how they sort of organize that information that they are sharing. When we are in this phase or dimension of multicultural education, the goal is to push the learners to be critics of knowledge, to be critical thinkers, to ask who's included in this information, who's left out, where does this information come from, why does it matter, does it matter? We want students to go deeper, to be problem solvers, to be critical thinkers, and they can only do that when they challenge where information is coming from and that they ask, well, what is the other point of view? And that's what knowledge construction is about. It's that process of pushing critique. It is that process of pushing critique. We understand from the authors that in this dimension, we can really create transformative curriculum, and we can have the kind of teaching that really inspires rigor and relevance to students' lives. As we move on to the third dimension of multicultural education, the authors are talking to us about prejudice reduction. And here on page 14, the focus is on the learners. The authors tell us that in prejudice reduction, this dimension of multicultural education describes the characteristics of students' racial attitudes and strategies that can be used to help them develop more democratic attitudes and values. So, in content integration, the focus is on the content and the materials you share. In knowledge construction, it's a process and inspiration of critique. But in prejudice reduction, as we go around the diagram here, we find that the focus is on the students and those things that we can do inside the classroom to help them get over their prejudices and biases. They don't come to us as blank slates. They have been acculturated by their families and their communities, and they are bringing those biases to the classroom. So the authors go on to talk about these approaches in that part of the reading that we can do as teachers to help reduce the prejudice that the students bring to the classroom, like creating cross-cutting superordinate groups. That's the reverse of subordinate groups. And in this approach, you mix up the students in the classroom so that you have boys and girls on teams, and you have kids from different ethnic backgrounds, different language abilities, different IQ abilities, if you will, so that they are used to that kind of diversity and working with students who and peers who are different from themselves. The author even talks about the effects of cooperative learning on achievement, that we need to build learning communities, if you will. It's a great strategy to reduce prejudice reduction because you are encouraging students to work together, to be cooperative rather than, working against each other so that they are always being competitive in nature. The author then goes on to talk to us about the effects of an empowering school culture as well. And what we learn is that when you have an empowering school culture, this dimension of multicultural education involves restructuring the culture and organization of the school, the entire school, so that students from diverse racial, ethnic, and gender groups will experience equality. The four dimensions of multicultural education discussed above, all the other four dimensions have to come together for this kind of cultural social system to actually work. So it's about bringing in all the other four dimensions: content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice reduction, and equity pedagogy, in order for one to have an empowering school culture or social structure. Now, we did not get to equity pedagogy, but it's important that we do. And in equity pedagogy, that exists when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, ethnic, language, and gender groups. So this dimension deals with the teacher, the pedagogue. And so it's the extent to which any teacher in a classroom is willing to do the work and just change your teaching ways, change your strategies, change your approaches, change the way you interact with students. You're adapting, your curriculum approach. Instead of, being the kind of direct giver of knowledge, you invite more classroom discussion. Maybe you invite the students to be more active in their learning as opposed to passive. So an equity pedagogue is someone who's going to go above and beyond and look for multiple ways to bring in multiple perspectives and to value the points of view of various cultural groups, as well as the points of view of his or her students as well. So these are the five dimensions of multicultural education. And I was thinking, what would these five dimensions look like applied to a science lesson? Well, let's take, for example, if one was a biology teacher, how could you sort of think about that dimension of content integration and include it into a ninth grade biology lesson? Well, as a former biology teacher, one could, I could imagine having a real discussion on skin color, for example. I think when we talk about difference, sometimes we don't want to talk about issues of, physical differences, but it's a great opportunity in a biology class to talk about why we have different pigments in our skin. It's due to the environment where peoples originated around this planet, and we can have a real conversation about pigment and protection from the sun as a real biological feature of human beings. We could also then, in the knowledge construction process, talk about stereotypes and where they come from. And for a lot of Americans, we don't understand that it was scientists like Linnaeus, like Blumenbach of the late 1700s, who used this idea of craniometry to talk about the shape and size of the skull and equate it to one's intelligence and moral character. This was absolutely false, but it held up for a century and a half. People believed it. And we believe in these ideas about stereotypes of people, some ethnic groups not being as smart as other ethnic groups. Have influenced the way that a lot of policy was driven around the world, even the institution of slavery. A lot of people thought it was okay because they equated African Americans as being part of the lowest forms of humanity on the planet and not really being humans based on the work of these scientists. So a lot of these stereotypes that we have today are from scientists from the early to mid and late 1700s that have carried over into the 21st century. It's a real opportunity in the biology classroom to talk about knowledge construction, where this knowledge comes from. And one can imagine that Linnaeus and Blumenbach were probably leaned in a certain direction with their ideology when thinking about others. We can just imagine that. And then as we move along to the other dimensions, prejudice reduction, how can a science teacher implement that into the classroom? Well, for that in that dimension, the focus is on the students and doing things in the classroom that would decrease the discrimination and biases that they may have and feel towards others. So a strategy for the biology teacher is to put students into learning communities, put them into cooperative groups so that they learn how to get along with students who are different from themselves. Equity pedagogy, that dimension deals with the pedagogue, the teacher. So it means that he or she needs to change the things that one does inside the classroom so that you move away from a kind of dictatorship in your classroom, but one where your students feel a sense of community. And you can invite discussions, have group work, create documentaries, have invited guests, share knowledge from multiple perspectives. These are all ways that science teachers can sort of adjust what it is that they do inside the classroom for that dimension. For an empowering school culture, how might that dimension affect a science classroom? Well, a multicultural perspective in this dimension extends beyond the classroom. It extends beyond a lesson. This is the recognition that multicultural education applies to the total school environment and our personal lives. So, for example, science teachers who ensure that kids of color are enrolled in A-level science courses, or that these students are included in science fairs, or that they sort of encourage or push them into science careers. So I hope you see that we can, even as math and science teachers, apply these dimensions to the work that we do. We just have to creatively think about how we can adapt what we do to fit the multicultural philosophy. Thank you. That's the end of this lecture, part 2, Multicultural Education, reading number 1.